Hello and welcome to Shadow Mountain Publishing's conversation with authors. I love having this opportunity to talk with other authors, and I'm so excited about this conversation with Rebecca Connolly today. Your book, Hidden Yellow Stars, is beautiful on like 2,000 levels. And so I can't wait to see where this conversation is going to go. And I can't wait to get to know you personally a little bit more too. So thanks for making time, Rebecca.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. First and foremost, we were talking before we started recording. As fellow authors, a good book cover is just like a gift because the words are like our soul on the page, and you want the cover to help a reader trust those words. And immediately when I got my copy of this beautiful book, I just immediately was just, I felt the joy and the sorrow. And I think that, and the beauty. And I think if you are going to try to invite a reader to open a book, those are some of the words you want to share and intrigue and entice a reader. Do you have thoughts that you want to share on the cover before we go any further to the insides?
Well, I absolutely loved the cover. When it was first sent to me, I just went, yes, absolutely yes. I mean, they had asked me for some ideas, but I didn't have a set image in my mind. I wanted it to stand out from other World War II covers just so that it's unique in its own thing. And I just love the two women whose coloring are different and who are standing back to back, which is how symbolically that's how it worked. They were back to back watching out for each other and looking outwards, and then to have the Star of David in the title just representing everything, it's gorgeous. And the simplicity of the cover too, there's not a ton going on, and that's how it should be. The focus should be on these two women and what they did.
Yes, I love that. Before we get too much into the meat of this conversation that I hope we get to have, just for your readers that are already loyal and love you, this is a little bit of a departure in genres per se. Do you want to talk about what drew you to tell? This is a true story. It's World War II, but do you just want to talk like 10,000 foot view of kind of this genre choice and this specific project?
Sure. So I've always loved history. I mean, my bread and butter is historical romance and Jane Austen era. That's my jam. But the historical fiction without the romance started with my book, A Brilliant Night of Stars and Ice. And that only happened because I discovered the story of the Carpathia when I went to the Titanic Museum in Belfast in like 2015. So it was an accident. I never thought that I was going to write historical fiction, because why would I go anywhere but romance? But the story was so captivating, and it didn't need a romance to make it more than anything. So that was my start. And then it's just kind of kept going. I keep finding these little kernels of awesomeness in history that I want to tell. And that's exactly how Hidden Yellow Stars happened. My dad, who loves history like I do, he was reading a newspaper article about Andrée Geulen. She had just passed away, and it gave a little blurb of her life and what she had done in the most superficial terms. And he sent it to me and said, this might be something to look into. And sure enough, it was. So that's literally how this happened, is my dad found an obituary.
I just want to thank your dad, because as a nonfiction inspirational genre author, my kids make fun of me that I will always see a movie or read a book that's a true story. And I love historical fiction for that reason, because as a teacher, it teaches me history in a story form. And I love that this is a true story. And I love that you already teased. I asked you before we started recording, because I have such a unique first name. Ganel-Lyn is pronounced 50 different million versions. Can you pronounce for the reader, because I think as a reader, I always pronounce it the way I want to pronounce it. And then if a book goes into a movie, I'm sometimes surprised, like, wait, that's how you're going to pronounce that? So our two main characters are these beautiful, strong, courageous, heart-centered women. How do you say their names?
So the first is Andrée Geulen, and the second is Ida Sterno. Now, I'm American, so when I was writing this, it was Andrée and Ida.
Okay.
But to honor them, it's Andrée and Ida.
I love that. I love that. This story is a true story, as we've said, about two women who are really the heroines who risk everything to save Jewish children from the Gestapo by hiding them throughout Belgium. I am super personally predisposed to love anything World War II. And I just talked to my neighbor about this the other day. Why am I always drawn to? I think the very first book I read as a child was Anne Frank's diary. And so I don't know if that's why, but from that point, I don't know how many stories from book form to movie form that if it's about World War II, I'm already interested. But I think at the core of that, and I hope this speaks to your readers, is that there's something about World War II that still feels accessible to me in history, right? Like, I don't know, the fashion, the cars, I don't know. There's still this accessibility in 2024 to World War II, anything. Yes. So it feels relevant to me. And it calls me as a student of history to ask myself every time I hear a story from World War II, what role would I play in that story? And I love to think that I'd be cast as your two main heroines. I always want to believe I'm the secretary that would hide the Frank family. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, the more I've studied World War II specifically, is it was complex, everyday people trying to live their lives and stay safe and feed their families and make a living and deal with the political, religious, and cultural poles of the time. And so I hope that I would be a heroine. I hope I would be the protector. I hope I would be the teacher that would be willing to do what your teacher was willing to do. But I don't always know that. And so I think first and foremost, what do you feel is the draw to World War II?
I think that those of us who are at least a little removed from it, we read about it, we study it, and we know what happened, and we're still trying to understand how it happened, and we're trying to identify with stories like this, with these people who went against the grain, who defied the Nazis or the Soviets or the Spanish, whatever military power, or, at the time, the Japanese, whatever power was in authority and harming so many. We want these stories of people who survived or who helped others to survive. And I think there are more stories like this than we can possibly identify, somewhere on such a small scale. I was looking up other people who had been honored as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, the Jewish organization. And some people are named just for saving one family. I'm going to get emotional. Just for saving one family. And if we could tell the stories of every single person who saved even one little Jewish child or one Jewish family, I think we could have entire bookstores that would be massive. We're Costco-sized bookstores of just hopeful World War II stories. And I think we know that somehow on an integral level. And so we keep looking for them. We want all of the good stories amidst the awfulness.
What a beautiful answer. And I think it's that backdrop of the darkness of this horrific war and what the atrocities and the volume of life lost. And I love that you just pointed out that someone was recognized for helping one. And for me as a speaker and an author, I'm always about the one. And I think what if we filled Costco's with stories of, with the backdrop of the horrific nature of war, but with the hope and the power of one person? And that brings me to this idea that this young school teacher is defying Nazis in Belgium because she is watching her students show up with these yellow stars. And she has this maternal nature about her, and she wants to protect them. I have a teaching degree. I am certified K through 8. So I wept as I'm reading because I still have handwritten notes from students that I've taught. And that's been 30 years that I've kept these little notes because each one of those children meant something to me. And yet she's watching almost in some lifetime awareness that she didn't even know how many Jews were in her community, because all of a sudden they're being required to identify themselves in this way by wearing these yellow stars, and she takes action. What do you want to say, especially to the teachers out there? I'm hoping there's some teachers that are listening to our conversation today that realize that, of course, it's a teacher that shows up and says, I'm going to do something about this because my students mean more to me than just the job I have.
Yeah. I think that teachers, in a lot of ways, they are adoptive parental figures. They have such a role in the lives of the children that they teach, no matter what age. They have such an influence. And it's impossible to separate that position with the feelings towards these children. You care about these kids, about not just about their education, but about their lives, about how they're doing, about where they go from here. And, you know, you're absolutely right. Of course, it's a teacher that is determined to do something and is intervening. And it starts so simple. The beginning of the book, she has all of her students put on aprons that are long enough, tall enough to hide the stars so that all of her students look the same. Nobody was going to know that in this little school that she was doing that. But that was the first thing, is that she didn't want her students to be afraid in her classroom. And that just expanded. The more that she saw, the more she became aware, the more she realized that children were at risk, the more she says, not my children. And it doesn't matter that she was never their teacher in most of these cases. Suddenly, these are all her students. These are all her children. And part of that is that she was a teacher, but part of it is because of who she was and this heart that she had, this teacher's heart. Of course, she became a teacher with a heart like this. And Andrée remembered these children for the rest of her lives.
I know. I think that's,
and their lives.
I think it's so profound that you as the author chose to tell the complete story. It was not just sometimes in World War II documentaries or books or movies, we get a snapshot. And I love that you make sure we understand that for the rest of her life, she knew these children's names, and both these women worked to reunite. Can you talk about her relationship and connection with Ida?
Yes. So Ida was one of the original members of the CDJ, the Committee for the Defense of Jews in Belgium. I'm not going to try to say it in the French way. And she had been brought in by some of the higher ups because of the connection. And she was working with a woman named Odile Auvert, who was a headmistress of a school that Andrée went on to teach at. And Madame Auvert and her husband were hiding Jewish students and their teacher in their boarding school. And they call Andrée into the office because things are getting a little more complicated, and the CDJ could really use some more helpers. And she, knowing Andrée, knowing her disposition towards these students, and remember, Andrée didn't know that these were Jewish students and their teacher hiding, but suddenly they tell her, and they ask her if she's interested in helping with some of this resistance work with these children. And that's how Andrée and Ida meet, is Madame Auvert introduces them. And pretty quickly, Andrée and Ida just get on like a wildfire. They are the perfect combination for each other. And Andrée was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, not a Jew. And so it was an interesting choice, but it was also very, very strategic, because as a woman with that fair complexion, she was never going to be guessed by the Nazis as being somebody working for a Jewish organization. So it made her quite valuable, because she would never be suspect. She could walk down the street and they would smile at her, and they did all the time. It made her a perfect operative and asset. And she realized that, which allowed her to take on riskier missions and assignments. And she was willing to do that because she knew she could get away with it. So she kind of used the Nazis' opinions against them.
Yes. And can you talk about how fat, right? That shows up into this story that turns. Yes. Can you talk about how, I mean, for those that haven't read the book yet, there's so many layers that it's like, it's such a beautiful and complex. And I think this subject matter deserves that. Like, there's something powerful when we decide as a reader or a writer to make sure we show layers. And so I really appreciated that. So I just want to pull in that next layer.
Yeah. So Fat Jacques is a character in this book. He, I believe he was originally Polish, but somehow he's in Belgium, and his history is a little fuzzy. But he was a Jew who, for whatever his reasons, was working with the Gestapo as basically an agent for them. He could spot Jews. He could, figure out who they were. He was their biggest asset in Belgium. And he is, if we have to put a face to the villain of this book, right, besides the general Nazis, it's Fat Jacques. Because he is betraying everything.
And that's the thing that I felt like was so important. And thank you for pointing that out, that like there's some complexities there. And that's why I started this conversation with the idea of we all want to cast ourselves in the role of Andrée and Ida. But what would be the conditions that would make someone kind of betray their own people and feel fear enough? I mean, that would be my guess, is that there's this complexity of fear. And I think any good story and any true story shows that there's not just a black or a white, and there's some complexity there. So I actually really love that he's the villain kind of / with this backdrop of the Gestapo, right? Which we know is the villain, right?
And as we understand it, he at this point doesn't have his family. It's not clear if they, or maybe it's just, I can't remember. Maybe it's just not clear in my brain. If his family is in camps or anything like that. But it's not just the fact that he was helping the Gestapo. He was ruthless. He was vicious. There is something else there besides just a fear for himself. There is zero regret on his part. There is zero compassion. So in many ways, he was, in their eyes, worse than the Nazis, because he was turning on his own people without shame or regret. And unfortunately, he was never brought to justice. Many people tried to find him after the war, and he had been condemned to death in absentia for what he had done, but he was never found and held accountable for his actions. So it's one of the great mysteries.
Wow.
And wow. I know that there's others in history that, were never brought to justice. And that just kind of irks.
I know. I think it's an interesting juxtaposition, a World War II movie that I recently watched, True Story of the man that kind of envisioned and designed and oversaw the gas chambers and Auschwitz, and his family living just outside the wall, living their normal quote unquote life. And then post-war, him running away, him eventually being found and brought to Nuremberg, and then family members relocating across, the United States. There's so many untold stories of post-World War II that I think it's so beautiful that we get this story where there's this undercover operatives that are doing these bold, courageous moves. But I think, there's also this ripple effect of the villains in the war and what's happened to their children and grandchildren. And I wonder, what is the social study of that as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I know someone, I've never met this person personally, and she's no longer alive, but her mother was someone on like Hitler's education board. And this woman she was a child. So there's the woman that I knew. She was a child, so she had nothing to do with it. But she was wonderful and kind and funny and, loved family. And I didn't know that was what her mother had done until a few months ago.
Wow.
And it does not make me think less of this woman that I knew. She had nothing to do with it. But I wish that I had known that before so that I could have sat down with her and just talked about what did she remember about how
her
she grew
perspective.
up.
Right.
What did
one of the children of this man said, he was compartmentalized. He was the great dad that came home and told me bedtime stories, and during the day was literally facilitating and the mastermind behind millions and millions of deaths. Yeah. So I think that's fascinating. I was trying to formulate what was my favorite escape part story or smuggling story, or I couldn't. And so I want you to answer maybe two parts of this question. On page 133, there's this beautiful moment. I decided to just let you tell me what was one of your favorite scenarios that Ida and Andrée had to go through. But what I really loved as a parent and as a teacher is on page 133, you talk about, you show how they're dealing with children, and as we were just talking about the children of this woman that worked for Hitler, and we talk about the children of the man who created the gas chambers, right? Yeah. Children are these beautiful gifts for a society. Yes. And so even though these women are taking care of kids in really scary, fearful situations, can I just read your words back to you? Please. I thought they were so beautiful. She said, this is not a game that had been set. Simone grinned and swinging her legs a little where she sat. Yes, it will be our secret. I love this game, Mademoiselle Claudette. She turned to look out of the window again, no doubt watching for sheep once more. Smile fading, Andrée put a hand to her brow, closing her eyes briefly. How did one explain to a child that this was not a game, but a matter of life and death? And yet, a fearful child is no child at all. So she could not be told if innocence was to be maintained. What a beautiful description for all of us as parents and aunts and grandparents, and right, that children really are our future. And here they were in these scary situations, but they were trying to preserve this beautiful magic of childhood in these horrific situations. So maybe take both that section that I just read to you, and then maybe share with us your favorite escape story that you wrote. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I love most about this book is that I didn't have to make up any of these escape stories. I had a number of amazing references, some of which were really hard to read, from these surviving children about their experiences. And some of them, for that, that section that you read, some of the children did not get to have that experience, even some of the ones that were hidden safely. There were some stories about these children that were hidden in some religious institutions. And I touch on this a little bit in the book with some, but I don't go into much detail. But some of the boarding schools that are convents and monasteries and seminaries, for some of them, the Jewish children were hidden and were safe from the Nazis, but they weren't safe from those that were there. The nuns or the priests treated them differently, and would punish them for not knowing the catechism. Why would Jewish children know the catechism? Or they would say things about Jews in front of the class, knowing these Jewish children would know they were talking to them, but the Jewish children couldn't react because then the other students might turn them in. Meals would be withheld, things like that. And some were not given kind treatment unless they converted to usually the Catholic faith, but not always, but it's Europe, so it's usually Catholic.
And that was really hard for me to read, those experiences, because my grandmother was raised Jewish. Her heritage is Jewish, and I touch on that in my author notes too. And her husband comes from a very strong, dominant Irish Catholic line. This is all on my paternal side. So I've got the Catholics and the Jews together in my blood, and I'm reading these stories of not having kindness and understanding there, but I'm also reading these beautiful stories of kindness and goodness from these amazing nuns and priests that are risking their lives. And there are some Jewish families that when they returned and were reunited with their children, if their children had chosen to convert and wanted to stay converted, their Jewish families cut them off. And I just cried reading these things. You survived the Holocaust, and because of the manner in which your child
chose to
survive spiritually and mentally and emotionally
and socially, really,
you're now in effect killing them in your own minds,
which I think is heartbreaking, but also a credit to you as an author in telling, once again, I'm going to say this multiple times, the complexities of these stories. We sometimes want to only cast the villain and the heroine, and we want everything to feel like Disneyland, a Disneyland story where we know who the villain is and we know who the heroine is, and that's the end of the story. And the reality is those priests and nuns that were being kind are just as much a part of the story as the ones that they did what they could, but they weren't kind, or the family members that were grateful to be reunited. And then those families that were reunited and almost didn't recognize each other, because think of the years that this war played out. I mean, I'm separated from my kids for a year or two at times for various reasons. And it takes a lot of reassociating and connecting. And so thank you for being an author that's willing to show complexity. It's hard to do as an author, but you do a beautiful job of that.
Thank you. And just remembering that these were children, and some of them had to grow up really fast. And some of them never found childhood again. I'm glad that I didn't have to write this book for about some children after, because that was just as hard.
Right. That's what, there's volumes of stories of after, of the rebuilding, of the reconnecting, of the healing, and some did it and some were not able to do it. Yeah.
But one of my favorites.
Oh, good. That's what I was going to say. Tell us about that.
Okay. So I was able to connect with one of the actual hidden children, Professor Shaul Harel. He has a beautiful memoir that was crucial to my research, and it's A Child Without Shadow. And it tells the story of his experience. And he's actually a character in the book. If you hear about little Charlie with his sister Regina, that's Shaul. And I had to include him because he was actually hidden by Andrée and Ida. And I love his story. One of the houses that he stayed at was a woman who would entertain Nazi soldiers, and she had Jewish children in the house. And he has this memory of being bounced on the knee of an SS officer who would have killed him, thrown him against a wall, felt himself unclean for touching him, but he didn't know. And the CDJ got, the kids out of there pretty quickly. But one of the beautiful things I love is that he was pretty young during this, but he survives. He goes on to become a world-class pediatric neurologist in Tel Aviv. How many lives does he save in his career? And that is one child that was saved. I don't have records of everybody else, but I have him. And that's incredible what he went on to do. And, he works with children. I think he's retired now, but so I love his story. It's amazing. I love the story of the newborn that was smuggled out of Malin in the sleeve of the operative and survived. One One of my favorite ones to write, though, is very bittersweet. It's the story of the boy who gets a chance to say goodbye to his grandmother on the train. His grandmother is leaving, and he's in the process of being relocated. And the grandmother had written to the CDJ to ask if she could see him and talk to him, because from all that she knew, he was the last surviving member of her family. And he might not have known that. It was unclear how much he knew, but she was being evacuated to safety and needed to know for herself that he was okay in order to get through that. And so writing that scene, they're not able to acknowledge their Jewishness, so he can't call her grandma as he would normally. And they can't really use names because she doesn't know what his code name is, and she can't use his Jewish name. But it's this coded scene of farewell, but also love. And I wrote this in early 2023. And I lost my grandmother in November of 2020, but I can still remember very distinctly several phone calls that I had with her. And this is my grandmother that was raised Jewish. And I just thought of this loving family that I come from, that she helped to create. And I turned this beloved grandmother who had lost so much into my grandmother. And I can still, when I read it, it's my grandmother that's doing the talking and saying, "I love you more than necessary," because my grandmother said it at least 4 times before she got off the phone. And that was just the way she was. And so writing that scene for me was cathartic, but also so vibrant. And so there were a couple of scenes that I cried writing as the author, but that one it held so much beauty to it that I just wept writing it. And so that's one of my favorites.
I love that you share that, because there's nothing more beautiful. It's not that way with every word or every sentence, but when I have an emotion writing as a writer, it is like the sweet spot. It's like what it makes all the other hard days of writing worth it when you know you're in this beautiful dance with the words. And I love anything about grandmother's love. Like there's something about a grandma's love. I held my grandma when she passed in bed. And to this day, it's been nearly 20 years. There's something that is a force. And I love that you're mentioning the fact that there's this beautiful tie of cathartic, like completion, an honoring of your grandmother and your heritage, and that circle back to this beautiful story. It's so why books are needed, and why books are a gift, and why reading changes us. And I just probably want to switch tones a little, and I don't want to stay too long here, but I think it's important, because I think especially when you're discussing World War II, you do a beautiful job of helping the reader understand the complexities of the constant messaging against Jews. And you do that in I think, a very thoughtful way, where each chapter head has some propaganda. And it's just a beautiful way of keeping the reader aware of, like, don't forget what Hitler was making sure was put out in the world about this group of people, or anyone that was different. It wasn't just Jews. It was anyone that was handicapped. It was if you were Seventh-day Adventist, if you were gay, if you were Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, like anyone that was different was propagandized. I don't think that's the right term, but it seems like it should be a verb, where it's like, it should be a verb that
they were undesirables.
They were undesirable. And you have some that are so, like, they catch my breath. Like I'm reading them and I'm like, how did we get into a world where any group of people would say this about another group of people? Like, I'm just turning to chapter 10. You say, deep and boundless hatred is an essential characteristic of Jewry. It is rooted in the devil's blood of the Jews and can only be distantly understood by the other peoples of the earth. That was in 1943.
Mhm.
Like, it's mind-blowing to me
Yeah.
where there is such power in our words. So as beautiful as the imagery of the words of this grandma and her grandchild and how they had to be coded in their speak, there was this other part of this part of history where the propaganda was not gentle. It wasn't coded. It was out and out hatred.
Yeah.
And so talk to us as an author what it took to go through all that propaganda and decide how to pick and choose for the chapter headings.
Yeah, I felt like I needed a shower
Yes.
after doing that. That was something that my editor and I discussed, because I love a chapter heading, and
And hate it, probably.
and hate it. But the Gestapo was a big faceless villain. And we had Fat Jacques, we talked about him, but he wasn't everywhere. He wasn't doing all of these things. The bigger enemy was the Nazis, but also the message that they were giving to the people that they were, I was going to say inhabiting,
Indoctrinating.
but not aliens. Indoctrinating.
Yeah, indoctrinating, yeah.
These countries that they had occupied, they are now the governing force, and they control the news. They control the messages that are out there. And this is what was out there. And some of these countries, some of the regular people who are not Nazis, they're not Gestapo, they're not assets, they're regular people, they're also taking up beating of Jews in the streets and destroying Jewish property, because in their minds, the Nazis would have left us alone if it weren't for the Jews.
Oh, so they're the other enemy because they've disrupted our lives by being in existence.
Exactly. The Nazis wouldn't be here making our lives miserable if they didn't hate the Jews so much. And so therefore, the Jews are the problem, which is exactly what the Nazis want them to think.
Of course. And it's the same of today, right? Like if you're only following the people that think like you on social media, then the algorithms keep perpetuating the pamphlets that they had to go out. I mean, we have to remember in 1943, you sometimes only knew the same 30 people in your community. It's who you shopped with and went to school with and went to work with. And so the information being controlled on a news level, like you just said, so here's Belgium, right? And then all of a sudden there's this outside force that comes in and now they take control of the news and the information. Sometimes when we scratch our heads post World War II and we wonder, how did highly intelligent people become the doctors and scientists that worked for Hitler? Well, guess what? When you start to include only information that vilifies another group of people, and like you said, oh, that's the agitator. If we remove the agitator, we'll remove this other force. Yeah. I think that's a really powerful point.
Yeah. There's a show on Disney Plus. It's about Meep Geese, who hid Anne Frank and her family.
It's so powerful. It's so good.
But there is something that her friend says, her friend who is not a Nazi.
But's dating the one, right?
Isn't she? She's dating one that goes on to become someone who works with Nazis, but isn't technically, whatever. But she says, she was talking about a Jewish business that had been just, not a Jewish business, an ice cream shop that had been destroyed because the proprietor had served Jews and the Nazis didn't like that. And she said how awful it was, but then she said, but there are ice cream shops in the Jewish part of town. How hard would it be for them to just go there? That's the problem. She's not a Nazi, but she also says, yeah, but yeah, it's horrible because they shouldn't be treated like that. But at the same time, stay on your side of town.
Yep.
That's part of the problem. That's what a lot of people had been indoctrinated to think. That's the thought process that enables people to think, I'll be left alone if I tell them that this boarding school is hiding Jewish children. And I know that they're hiding Jewish children. Yes. And so they'll turn them into the Gestapo because then they get bonus points and they won't have as hard a life because they did that. And they have to live with themselves, but they can because I'm protecting my family by telling the Gestapo that Jewish children are over there.
This is exactly, to repeat the same word, the theme of this conversation is the complexities of like you want to cast yourself as the Andrée and the Ida.
Yeah.
But the reality is what is your line where all of a
Mhm.
sudden you see that this is self-preservation or protection? And sometimes all of us can do this as human beings. We other another group
Mhm.
because they look like they're the source of our pain. I've been exploring the story of Coco Chanel and Dior, who were designers through World War II. Coco Chanel worked with the Nazis and designed for, and Dior rises up and and what he has to do and becomes a designer. And then that post World War II rebuilding of where then anyone that was helping the Nazis
Mhm.
were treated in similar ways that the Jews had been treated. I mean, it's as if we don't know how to control the pain, and the
Yes.
pain takes over, and then the pain perpetuates and compounds. And so as you were writing this, what did you do as an author to deal with compounding pain as an author?
I ate a lot of chocolate.
Amen, sister.
that was advice from my dad, was don't let the Dementors get you.
Yes, yes.
And
In the
so
great words of J.K. Rowling, right?
That was something that I was very aware of, but he was also very good at reminding me, and I love that because it's his heritage that is in a lot of ways warring against each other in these stories, not the Nazi part, but the religion part.
Right.
But that I'm trying to understand and explore and sink into, because as the author, I cannot do anything less than go full steam into this. But he said, don't go too deep, meaning don't carry it with you. So I had to be able to separate myself from that, separate me, Rebecca Connolly, from the material that I was having to work with to tell the true story of Andrée and Ida. And that's hard. And there is no way to completely separate. I am not that great at compartmentalization, but I had to remind myself that the war is over. And these particular stories have come to their end, whatever that end is. And there's nothing I can do about that. But I can share their story in the hopes that we will continue to learn from it, and remind myself and my readers that I am telling a story of hope. And any story of hope has a whole lot of ugly and hurt and pain in it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a need for the story of hope. There wouldn't be a hope. It would just be, this is a nice story. If you don't have the opposition, which can be brutal and inhumane, the hope part of the story wouldn't matter.
And what's so beautiful is you show the opposition on many layers.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to see the opposition in Hitler's face.
Absolutely.
It's easy to see the opposition in a concentration camp. It's easy to see an opposition even in the wearing of a yellow star. But where's the opposition in a nun who's being maybe not kind to a Jewish child that is
or
being
the neighbor who looks at the star on the chest before looks at your face?
Exactly.
Just
Exactly.
the expression in someone's face.
Right. Which I love what you say as an author, that if we don't tell these stories, then in moments each day that we do that, where we walk down the street and we decide we know someone's story based on one piece of information, or we already decide who's going to be our friend and not be our friend at church or work or school because of based on their heritage or their religious identity. I think it's such an important time in history. And as many stories have already been told, I think your book is a testament that there's still stories that haven't been told that we need to tell, especially for the teachers out there in the world that think that they're doing post-COVID teaching. I have dear friends that are in the classrooms every day trying to deal with the outsourcing that had to happen during COVID, and now the social implications of a teacher today. This is a story that I think teachers should absolutely pick up and read, because I think it will give them that fire back of like, why do they keep showing up? You've done a beautiful job on so many levels. And I know that part of your soul is walking around in these pages. And I only know that from my own experience as a writer, that there's a piece of my soul on every page. What do you want readers to know? And you've touched on this already, but what do you want them to know or feel by reading this book? What was your prayer with the chocolate as you wrote it?
There are so many. There are layers to that too. That no one should ever be made to feel less than. That one person really can make a difference if they are determined to do so. That any given awful situation always has a potential and a possibility for hope. That we're more alike than we think. That was one of the things. Before doing my research for this, I would never have said that the Jewish religion and the Catholic religion had anything in common. And those are in my blood. I can say these things, but I came to realize that with both of these very strong, very prominent religions, it is also tradition and lifestyle as well as religion. And so I can see both sides of it with these families that had a hard time with this. It's not just the faith that they're giving up, it's the tradition of our families. And in some ways, the tradition is harder to give up than the religion. I've got, for example, my grandfather was really not that religious. He was Catholic, brought up by very strong Catholic parents. He had siblings that were very dedicated, devoted to the faith as well as the traditions, him not so much. But he was still Catholic, and the kids still went to parochial school and were taught by nuns. And my great-grandfather was raised Jewish and brought up his children as Jewish, but he was really not that Jewish, but he was still Jewish. His father was very Jewish, but he's still Jewish. And I am neither Catholic nor Jewish, but I feel these faiths and these traditions so strongly now, understanding these people that I've come from that are also in this book, these beautiful nuns that said, we will not change their religion or their heritage. We will honor who they are. There were some nuns that focused their classes on Psalms, which their Jewish children would also know so that they could participate in class without feeling like they had to read the New Testament or be in any way converted. They would focus on the Old Testament because they knew the Old Testament. And that's just, it's a small thing, but it is so beautiful and unifying. And I love it so much. And God bless Shaul Harel. When he found out that I have Jewish blood, he called me up. And he said, Rebecca, your last name is Connolly. How are you Jewish? So I got to explain to him how the Jewish part of my blood came to me, and that I was able to find members of my grandmother's family that had died in the camps that we had never known about, actual names, and put them on our family tree. So I'm telling him about all this, and he, knowing that I'm not Jewish by religion, he said, so you're in this book too.
Oh.
He who actually lived this story and is an actual character and knew the characters in my story is telling me that my Jewish heritage puts me in this story as well. And I think there's a lesson in that for all of us. You don't have to have Jewish blood or a Jewish faith or a Jewish tradition to see yourself in this book. You can be the children. You can try to understand these families that are being torn apart for their own good, and the families that are being torn apart at the camps, not for their own good. And these women who are fighting tooth and nail to save these families as best they can, and to try and throw it in the face of the Nazis without getting in trouble, without actually throwing anything in the face of the Nazis. We can all be in this book and in these stories if we are willing to put ourselves in those situations. Maybe we don't need to be Fat Jacques, but maybe we can be some of these more vulnerable people. And I think if we just allow ourselves to do that a little bit more in books like this and in our lives, there will be fewer less thans out there in the world.
What a beautiful answer. I too, I have Native American and Irish heritage, and I grew up in a very diverse religious and cultural community. And I've been working the last year and a half on an interfaith community online for this exact reason that you just said. That when we don't make it so much about conversion, but on education and understanding, there are so many things that are create in me holy envy. My Jewish brothers and sisters create holy envy. My Catholic brothers and sisters create holy envy. My Muslim brothers and sisters have created holy envy for me because they've taught me more about keeping my faith. And I love that in an unintentional way, a story like this shows what power one can do, but also the power of keeping our faith.
Yeah.
And when our faith is different, that doesn't lessen us as a community. It actually strengthens us.
Yeah.
And that those nuns actually were put in a beautiful stewardship to watch care over these Jewish children. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to point out and highlight.
And it's interesting because both of these women who are at the center, they weren't women of faith in the traditional sense. Ida was a Jew, but she was a Jew by tradition. She was not practicing.
Right.
And Andrée had been raised Catholic, but because of her perception of the world, because of what she had seen and how she felt, she was an atheist at this point. And so as much as this is a story about faith, it's not a story about religion.
You're right.
It's faith in humanity, faith in each other, faith in the ability of good people to act and do things, faith of good against evil, faith in the innocence of children, faith in the preciousness of all life. You know, there's a lot to be taken from these stories. And I kind of love that these women aren't religious women because it removes that as their reason for acting.
And really shows what lived faith looks like. Lived faith is very different than lived religion. And I love holy envy of religious practice, but I love that you're teaching through this story that hope and faith is a lived experience when you choose the plan B and C and D and E of life. And in war, that's what's required if you're going to survive, is choosing that hope plan. In our last conversation starter, which if you have something else you want to say, but the reason I say it that way is that I hope these questions have been conversation starters for the listeners. I hope that they listen to you and I talk, and now they go have conversation starters of their own.
Yes.
And they use this book as maybe the starting off point. Maybe they don't, but I think every question that we've shared today is a conversation starter that needs to be happening in lots of homes and neighborhoods and communities. So I hope that my questions were just conversation starters for our listeners. But my last conversation starter question for you is this. If you could sit with Andrée and Ida and share with them a thought, a feeling, an expression of gratitude and insight, what would you say at some future luncheon that you get to have with them someday?
Oh, I don't know what can be said beyond thank you. But having learned about them, having read about them, I think that they would both kind of shrug. And say, I did what I thought was right. And I think I would just want to ask them questions after, bathing their shoulders with my tears. I would want to ask them, how did you feel so strongly that you risked so much? Because that is the kind of courage that we all want to have and hope that we'll have. But they actually did have it. And I don't know if that's something you only find in the crucible of adversity or if that's something you're aware of at any other time. And then how do you go on from that? What do you do with your life after that? I know that Andrée continued to devote herself to social justice and good works for the rest of her life. And she's a very passionate, fiery woman. We kind of figure that out in the book, but she continued to do that. I didn't live very long after, and you kind of understand why after you read the book, but I think that she would have continued to do the same. And the question is, how do extraordinary people become extraordinary? And
Yes. And would they even call themselves a heroine? Would they even, I think sometimes the heroines and heroes of our lives are living that story, and they're not watching it from the end view. They're
right.
living it every day and showing up. I wonder if they would push back to you, Rebecca, and say, I just did what I felt called to do. I think especially the teachers of the world that have changed my life. It's the reason I became a teacher is I had one teacher that changed how I saw myself and
Yeah.
the world. I weep when I think of her. Her name was Miss Kraus, which is very German, and she was
Love it.
very tough, and she changed how I saw my abilities and how I saw myself. And so I think that the true heroines of the world don't even know that they are, and
Yeah.
and
They
and
wouldn't call
that's
themselves extraordinary at all.
yes, and I think they would say back to you, Rebecca, thank you for telling our story, and thank you for honoring us in what we thought was just the everyday survival moment of
Mhm.
what was presented to us.
Yeah.
Do you have a
Andrée said at one point, when you are doing what you feel to be right, fear is in the background.
yes, it's beautiful. Thank you so much for this beautiful book, this beautiful gift. For the teachers in your life, for anyone listening to this, go buy this. Your teachers have enough lotions and candles for teacher appreciation. So I'm going to just do a call that this is a perfect gift to give someone that you see as a heroine or heroine ish, maybe not even see themselves that way. And I love giving a book as a gift because it
Sure.
lives long on a shelf.
Yes, it
And
does.
thank you for your time, for your gifts, for sharing this story, and for putting the complexities on the page. I really felt changed by it, and I know anyone that reads it will feel the same.
Thank you. It was an honor to write this book.